I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. On this video, we're back on the 1970 Nova in the shop. If you haven't seen the previous videos, please go back and watch it. But how we came to this point, we got the car in the shop, we removed the suspension, we then mounted it to the frame jig, made sure everything was level, made pickup points for this car on parts that we knew we were going to remove, stripped everything off the car that we knew we weren't saving as far as sheet metal. So we cut a lot off this car. There's obviously not a lot left. We sandblasted what was left down to bare steel, and we epoxy coated it with 2 coats of black epoxy, leaving our weld through primer in certain areas. So on this video, the goal at the end of this video is going to be, not in this order, but have the firewall assembled, the front cowl sections assembled, the whole floor pan assembled, the frame rails assembled, the 2 rear cross rails on the Nova assembled, the trunk drop off, and the trunk floor pan. At that point, this should complete the whole bottom of the car. Saying that, I will be completely honest with you, everything on this car has already been test fitted except the main floor section. It was just me, so I couldn't get it in there. But realistically, everything's been test fit. I already got it down to epoxy primer and bare metal. So let's stay tuned. The first part of the video, I'm gonna show you that process. I'll come back, we'll show you the parts and what they look like in the stage before we assemble them, and then the second half of the video is going to be us putting this car together and welding it, and I'll show you that process. So let's show you how you strip the parts. Stay tuned. I hope you enjoy the video. We're going to try to keep it really fast and keep the parts flowing because there's a lot of information we're trying to show. So this firewall right here, what I'm doing, all the rest of the parts are fit on the car. I'm in the pre-fitment stage at this point. So what I've decided to do on this firewall, if you've seen in a previous video, is I'm going to use the factory subframe mounts that were on this Nova. We jigged off them. So I drilled out all the spot welds on this firewall, and I'm going to go ahead, I believe it's an AMD firewall, and we're going to go ahead and just remove those old supports. We'll put them to the side. The owner can take them if he wants, or we'll leave them here for a car that might need a patch or something like that. I'll let the owner decide. So we just drill out the spot welds, use an air hammer, and then once those pieces are removed, you're going to see I'm going to grind down to bare metal in the future. But right now you can see there's areas under the spot welds on a lot of these panels that are bare metal. This is pretty common in most of these pre-assembled parts, and a reason why I don't usually like the altogether pre-assembled parts. On this firewall, the owner also requested that we shave down the firewall. He's going to go with an aftermarket AC like a lot of these cars are. Unlike the first gen F bodies, which I would suggest someone doing like a 67 to 69 Camaro or any other cars they make it. If you're installing the firewall, go ahead and just buy the already shaved down firewall. It's going to save some time, effort. It's going to be one piece. This car, we don't have the option, so Detroit Speed makes a firewall closeout kit. You can do this just out of steel, and I realized the Detroit Speed kit is supposed to be installed on top of the original firewall that's installed in a car that already has all this stuff, you know, installed, and you're just kind of placing it over it. What I'm doing with this one, and I told the owner I can do the sheet metal steel, and he already had it and he said it wasn't a big deal, let's just use this one. So what I decided to do was just cut it around the curve. I tack weld it in place, so we're going to try and make it look smoothless and seamless in the sense that, you know, it's going to look like it came from the factory this way. Once I got everything tack welded with the MIG welder, I came back through with the TIG welder, and what I'm just doing, just using mild steel rod, 1/16 inch red thoriated tungsten, and I'm just running through the backside and the front side and just doing as close to a solid run as I can. You can see right here the other side's already welded, and I'm just coming through the backside. The reason I'm doing this is just to make it a little bit cleaner. You know, when you come through and you penetrate, it all's penetrated, but there's a couple spots that are going to be divots and imperfections. So realistically, what I'm trying to do here, if I run a second pass on top, I can spread out my
my puddle a little bit more in my filler rod and fill up the little bit of holes without adding too much heat. And then when I grind it back down, it's just a little bit easier to get a smoother transition on this firewall. The idea is, I realize there might be some filler on here, but if I can just put a little bit less, it will come out even better. So now that I've verified the firewall and everything fits, we're going to go ahead and start removing some of these parts. As I'm removing these parts, so the trunk floor's already been removed, marked out and everything, I marked on these frame rails where the floor pan supports would have been those plates for the torque box area in the rear, the front spring mounts, and then coming up the trunk floor pan, we're going to reuse that cross rail section and everything that came on the trunk floor. The plan changed initially what we were thinking, and what I've done on the other Novas, when the frame rails are good, I'll keep that cross rail. This car, obviously, it was too bad, so we're going to go ahead, and now that I know where those plates are, I can sit there and mark where I can get my spot welder in. And what I'll do, I'll rosette weld from the bottom of the frame rails and come up. Everything else I try to rosette weld, or I try to spot weld, I'll do it from the top. So right here, what we're looking at, I'm sandblasting all the parts. The owner wanted everything removed on these parts front to back, and the sandblaster is the most efficient way to do it and make sure we have all the E-coat off. Saying that, it's a really good thing that we did this, especially on this floor pan, because again, there's small hidden rust under these things. This is just a couple spots I'm showing. There was a lot more I was able to take out the camera real quick and just kind of blast around them and come back and show you. So realistically, these parts, they started surface rusting before they're E-coated. This is a problem. This is a problem with powder coated parts, that you just buy from cheap aftermarket companies. This is a problem. They're not worried about the process when the parts were sandblasted to pre-coating. And what we're trying to do in this shop, if the owner allows us, is I can control the process. I could sit there and sandblast these parts, and I know everything's bare metal. I watched it with my eyes, so then I can come back that same day or early the next morning within that window, look at the parts again, and then we just apply our epoxy coat right in time. We also know that epoxy coating is by far superior on bare metal adhesion and rust protection than anything else. So if your E-coat is under your epoxy coat, your base material is still limited by the E-coat. If that lets go, your epoxy primer might let go. If rust starts forming under there, it has a better chance of coming back through the epoxy primer. So now that everything's sandblasted, this is the same day, I'll go ahead and I have everything hung up. Everything looks good, clean, fresh metal, and I'll apply my weld through primer on all the areas that I feel we think we're going to weld. Once I'm done with that, I'll go ahead and tape them out with some tape, and then now we're going to go ahead and apply our epoxy primer. This will leave our weld through prime areas coated, so I don't have to re-scuff the epoxy primer. Taking epoxy off is not the end of the world, but if you've ever done it, it's not. If you can avoid it, it's definitely something you want to spend the extra time with the tape and the weld through primer. I realize that some of these areas, if you flip the trunk over, you'll see weld through primer throughout those areas also. And a lot of that, you wouldn't need weld through primer on the top side because you're obviously welding, and that would be a bare metal spot. And actually the spot welder would work better on the bare metal also. Saying that, we're in North Carolina, it's real humid. I told you I don't like to leave, and we like to control the sandblasted metal, and it will start flash rusting within 24, 48 hours. So the idea is to get epoxy, get weld through primer, get everything coated on this thing, and I'll just come back through and re-scuff the weld through primer as I'm cleaning everything up, and we'll put another coat of epoxy to seal everything off. The next day we'll be ready for assembly.
As you can see, we've done a lot of work up to this point. Now the fun gets to begin, that we get to start assembling. I do want to go over a couple things. Right now you saw we blasted all these parts down to bare metal. I got everything taped off with the weld through primer, And everywhere we're gonna weld both sides because we can't go through the epoxy. So these have 2 coats of epoxy on. They've been stripped down to bare metal. This is what makes, you know, a lot of comments I'm gonna address is a lot of people say just buy a, you know, an aftermarket body. Brand new car, don't use this. Well, first thing with this Nova, right now at the time in the filming of the video, you cannot buy a 68 to 72 Nova brand new body, an aftermarket body. So this is what we're left with. However, also with the aftermarket bodies, a lot of those, I'm not saying every company, but what makes us a little bit different, if the owner allows us, we don't force anything on them, but an aftermarket body, they're trying to cut costs everywhere they can. So you're not gonna get the epoxy coat, they're gonna use the E-coat, and the whole thing's kind of thrown together. We've had to fix some of them in the past with fitment issues, gap issues from other shops and everything else. So saying that, everything we're gonna do, if the owner allows us, we'll give a full metal body. You've seen us put the front ends, everything, and on this car, we're gonna put some more on. It's gonna roll out of this shop on its wheels looking like a 1970 Nova with 2 coats of epoxy on bare metal. You could see from that floor pan, when we started ripping that thing apart and sandblasting it, I showed a couple spots. That floor pan had lots of rust hidden below the E-coat. That's just in the cheap manufacturer. I mean, it's good. These parts are really cheap for what you get, but we can't control how long they've been sit out in the weather before the E-coat was applied. So if there's rust forming, they apply the E-coat over it. Well, that's what you get. That's the rust is there, and it's going to start forming in the future. Will it really matter as good as these cars taken care of? Probably not, but I mean, do you want the bottom of your car start rusting or, you know, not? The rest of the parts, I gotta say, for the most part, when I was blasting, I didn't find any rust. So it's hit or miss on the parts. But we got our 2 coats of epoxy. You're gonna see, after we're done assembling this, we're gonna come back and hopefully within that 3-day period, the window, we should get this done really today to maybe tomorrow. We should be about 2 days all welded up, and then we could come back through and we're gonna spot in our epoxy over our weld through primer, possibly scuff those areas up. So some parts of this car might have 3 coats of epoxy, but it'll be one sealed up car and everything. I believe this is the best way to build it. If the owners allow us to do this, this is what I recommend. Obviously, not everyone wants to go this level. I'm really happy when an owner wants to go all in and just wants a rust-free brand new car. So, like I said, trunk panels done. We also, like I said, taped off everywhere that I thought the weld through primer is going to have to go, that we're going to have to weld. Obviously those are frame rails. We saw our firewall. Now we shaved down this piece, we added this in there, so this is ready to install. Same thing, we're able to get epoxy in these pockets where we might not have been able to spray in there. So I'll show you how that is getting assembled. We have all our accessory pieces there and the bottom floor pan. It's a whole lot easier to put epoxy on these panels right now versus laying under this car and spraying up. I mean, it can be done, but now's the time to do it. Then we just got to spot in our edges and get them done. One more thing I wanted to show you, the difference between a Dynacorn frame rail and an AMD. I didn't notice, we've only used AMD frame rails on the Novas in the past. So if you're buying one of these cars and you're thinking about going back and forth on the frame rails, this is the AMD frame rail right here. You can see it's a epoxy coated and everything. It has this rear bracket on it. So the AMD comes with it, and it has the indentation for, it would be the, should be the seat belt mount, I believe so, I have to remember right, but in the F-body cars, this is where the seat bolt bracket and everything from the floor pan sit in there. The Dynacorn frame rail, both of them again have been on these frame rail jigs and they're fine fitment, but the Dynacorn, you could see right here, there is no bracket. It took me a minute, we had them off, and then I had, you know, we're halfway through it. I forgot to tape it off, so I'll have to clean it off and add more weld through primer, but we don't have the bracket back there, and you can see it's smooth out here. There's no indentation for a seat belt. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna cut some slits when we get the floor pan sit on there, lift it up, hammer them down just to make sure it fits okay. What I have said in the past, and this holds true now, don't throw away your old parts, because I had to go out where we keep our scrap parts for these cars. Like I said, I don't throw any of these parts out until the car leaves the shop. Had to go out there and grab the original bracket. You see it's got some pitting on it, but it will be fine. We sandblasted it, put it in weld through weld through primer. We'll add epoxy on the next one, and we'll just add it onto the bracket as we see fit. So let's start doing the fun part, and let's start building this car. Like I said, some of it's already been together, so it should go pretty smooth. We're gonna test fit most of this car. I can weld up some of the rails first. You'll see we are gonna wait to the final weldment till we got most of the car together. But I'll show you how we do it. Stay tuned, and let's get to the second half of the video.
So we've arrived at what I consider my favorite part, the actual assembly of the car and the final assembly, where I can really spend the time and get everything together and make sure it's dialed in properly. Saying that, remember, we jigged all these frame rails off the original car. This car was straight. I verified that it wasn't hit hard in the back. Nothing got bent. The frame rails did look good except for the very back 2-inch corner, and we're very confident those frame rails were in the right spot. So I made these jig points off there. These frame rails fit in there for the most part. I had to pull a little bit in the center, but the shackle points lined up really good. The front points where I had e-brake brackets, they lined up really good. And what I decided to do was clamp them in first, verify all the fitment. We're pulling down the front to make sure they sit down really straight against that front jig piece. They kind of, like I said, they didn't want to bow up. The curvature was a little bit different on these frame rails. This is why I like doing it on a frame jig, because I can match the actual curvature of the original car. Once I'm happy with that, I'm just putting one tack in each jig piece so it's easy to remove, where I can just get a cutoff wheel and I'm done. What I'm going to do now is put the cross rail on this car. What I ended up doing, and I'll recheck it this time, is I'm centering up the cross rail. So I measured side to side. I know where the center is on my frame jig. I know where the center is on my frame rails. And what we'll do, we'll drop a plumb bob down and make sure all those centers line up. We'll also transfer this down the road to the trunk floor and make sure that's also centered. I'm also putting, like I said earlier, that bracket on the Dynacorn frame rail. I didn't say it earlier, but I'm not a huge fan of putting dissimilar companies on different sides of the car, for instance, frame rails. You know, normally I would say we just do the AMD on both sides, or even the Dynacorn on both sides. I know the owner found the AMD one, and then the Dynacorn one he found down the road. It was the only option. So at this point, I told him with a frame rail, I mean, the frame rails are different in shape anyway on how the trunk floor goes, and we're going to be mini tub in this car and everything else, so it's not the end of the world with the frame rails. I'd say we go ahead and do it, and we'll see the differences on there for our knowledge too, and he was good with that. So on quarter panels and stuff though, that is not something I would do. Normally on these cars, if we put a quarter panel on one side, we find the same brand and we put the same quarter panel on the other side, because if there's some differences, it's a lot more noticeable on the outside of the car. So what I'm doing right now, I decided to go ahead and weld in the cross rail to the frame rails. This is the only thing we're welding at this point, because I am happy with where everything sit. Don't forget, we had this whole back end of the car together except the main floor. So the only thing I didn't verify was the firewall area is in line with the rear seat pan, trunk pan area. That's the only thing that we don't know is right. So if for some reason that's wrong, we could sit there and move this whole section forward and we can fix it. But saying that, the frame rails, I know everything looks good, the measurements are verified, and this cross rail is where it's supposed to be. So that's not a huge end of the story, and it was easier to weld this in, as you can see, versus, you know, just screwing it in and coming back, because how the trunk floor drops down. So there is certain parts you're going to have to weld in beforehand. If you do have to weld them in, you need to verify and test fit everything else along the line in case there's issues. Don't forget, these aftermarket part companies are great. We're lucky to have them to put these cars on the road. However, there's definitely some tolerance issues in these parts. In the front, because the floor pan's going to go down, I'm also putting a quick tack strip across underneath where the main floor pan will go. Again, this is something that I could just lift the floor pan up and cut one time. The rest of everything else underneath where I put those rosette holes, I'm just coming back through right now, and I'm a fan of screws and clamps. I don't feel like you could put too many screws and clamps in all these things. The screw holes, especially in the frame rails, I usually leave them so they're not in the way of me jumping around, and I'll just come back through. I have to MIG weld on there anyway, so I'll just weld those holes while I'm welding everything else up and putting it out. I could also put a lot more screws and get in areas that the clamps will not be able to get into. And you see in the back here, I'm only putting 2 screws on the down part to really pull the trunk floor down. The reason here is because the spot welder will finish cranking the rest of the trunk floor down. Don't forget, I used a pneumatic spot welder, so it does the crimping and the welding at the same time. We are going to verify, now that we verified also the trunk is centered on the frame rails, both in the front and in the back, and it's centered on the jig, I can go ahead and clamp everything in. Another thing I'm doing right now is I'm going to install the trunk drop-offs with screws. A lot of this I won't weld the very ends until I put the quarter panels on the car, because that's going to hold on these Novas how the quarter panel goes in and out is where that front area is. These seem to fit really well, so I'm pretty confident in that. But again, I might come back through and weld up to that point, and then when we put the quarter panels for the first time and we pull the wheel houses off, then we go back and re-weld it. This rear cross rail support, that's a piece that just kind of fits under there in the back. You kind of just level that with the frame rail. Again, I'm not welding this. Just come back through. I'm going to screw it in. Everything's prepped on this panel. I actually did sandblast that whole part and just covered the whole thing in weld through primer, since there's going to be a lot of welding done on this one. I did kind of overkill it on the rear trunk pan, the cross rail clamps. That's something I'll probably take some of them off. At least I know where all my clamps are. And now I'm coming back through with the spot welder. You'll see in a little bit. And I will start spot welding from the center out. Now that we've done that, we're going to work our attention on the patch panels for the front cowl side panels. So what I decided to do, I went over this in a previous video. I was super happy with how the cowl sandblasted, how strong it was, in the location it is. We're not trying to create more work for us than we have to. So for me, it was easier to take these side cowl panel pieces, which people have problems with all the time, and I'm one that we have to pull, pry, and just cut these things so much that it's easier for me to leave what we're happy with there and just patch in. You see, I got everything like it would. We're going to put our rosette holes where our door pieces are in the back, our supports there, and then what I'm going to do, I'm just butt welding with the MIG welder all the way down that seam, and I'm actually not even going to grind it out. I'm going to pretty much do a continuous weld there, and then I'm going to come back through with seam sealer, and it'll look almost factory. It'll be a lot stronger, it'll save us some time, and I think the weld is far superior than it would have been just messing with all this original metal. And I think the product's going to be better, because everything up here now with the front fenders and everything is just braced off the factory. So like I said, I like replacing parts, but if we don't have to, there's no reason to. I'm going to do the same thing on the front. Now that the back one's all welded up, we'll come back through and just tack it in. And same thing, we're going to weld the back side of this thing. We're going to tack it down and then come back through and then weld continuously on the other side. Before I go ahead and weld this, I want to make sure I can fit my side cowl vent piece, because it's got to be pulled up in the back, but again, I know for the most part it's going to fit. What you don't want is this piece not fitting right, and then you go ahead and weld everything up. So you could see right here, the bottom, I saw that we need to just pull it in a little bit. Even with just that section of the cowl side vent panel, it's trying to stick out too far. So a ratchet will help right there. Tack them in there. I can pull the ratchet off, and once I'm happy with how everything fits, like I said, I could just do a continuous weld right down the whole thing, clean it up after I epoxy everything with some seam sealer, and then we can put our side cowl piece on. The idea behind here is we want to finish this inside cowl area before we even tackle the outside one. Get all the rust out of it, get everything welded up, get all the jobs done, because you know, spraying in there with a spray gun, you're not going to get everything covered. So right now is the time to do all your metal work and your seam sealer work on the inside of this panel. I will say too, if you're having problems welding on the weld through primer on this area where I'm at right now, just take off the weld through primer. For me, I run my power a little bit hotter, so the weld through primer, it doesn't bother me in my welding at all. I can weld just as good with the weld through primer on there as I can. But like I said, it's easy. There's no reason we use the weld through primer to take a surface prep disc or something, a DA. You can just rip this weld through primer and expose the bare metal pretty easy. You could also see with the weld through primer, I like showing it even where I did that rosette hole up top. The weld through primer, it doesn't bubble up and peel. That's the only problem with epoxy primer. It has no heat protection, as far as it has no UV protection, one. Two, the heat protection from the welder, it bubbles the primer up. And once it bubbles and the heat releases the primer, you have to scuff that area off. So that's why I try to come in at least that inch to keep the heat out of the weld through primer. And then like I said, I run my DA through the whole thing after I'm done cleaning up all my welds and everything. And I can see if any more epoxy came off. Like I said, if the base epoxy has been removed from heat, you could put more epoxy on top of it and it'll shrink it right up and pull it off. So they won't do it on the weld through primer. I still try to prep the weld through primer, scuff out the area, and get most of the weld through primer off before we go ahead and put our new coat of epoxy on there. But saying that, like I said, this is, I feel, the best way to do it. Weld through primer, it obviously does its job because it does stay on the car and it doesn't let go like the epoxy primer. So as you can see, I was able to get the firewall in through the back of this car and get it up for final fitment. I'm using the bolts for the fenders to center it and then a bunch of clamps, and I'll come back through with screws and verify everything's there. This firewall, you're going to see, we're going to weld this thing in pretty much as soon as we're done screwing. The reason is I'm confident that it is in the right spot, kind of like that cross rail. It only goes in one spot. We know it goes along the top seam. We had it test fit once already. We know those brackets for the subframe mounts are in the factory location because we jigged off them. So there's no adjustment in this firewall. It's pulled against both sides of the factory cowl panel and side cowl panel pieces. So again, we're confident that we could go ahead and weld this and be done with it. It's not going to get in the way of installing any other parts. So same thing I was telling you earlier. If you want to take off the weld through primer and save a little bit of time, go for it. It'll help out. What I'm going to do is just weld right through it. You could see how it just discolors a little bit around it. And then in the cleanup phase, like I said, that's where I'll get everything down to bare metal and smooth out. And then we'll come back through with our epoxy after and do it. So we're putting our main floor pan in. This is the first time the floor pan's been in. Like I said, it was just, this is a multi-person job. If you're by yourself, I mean, you not saying you can't do it being creative, but it is a thing that's a pain in the butt to get in. So when everyone got home, we test fit this floor for the first time, and now we're going to see how everything lines up. And actually, we kind of ran into some issues. We started moving the floor pan around and everything, and then the more we started looking, we'll go over some of those issues that we just run across.
So we're going to wrap it up for the Nova on the night as we ran into a pretty major snag, we'll say. It's not the end of the world, but something I got to think through a little bit. I kind of already did some measurements and some thinking on it. So where we're at right now, you see, first of all, everything that's welded in this car is not, I know before I weld everything, it's in the right spot. Everything that's not welded was, we test fit it first and then we figure out where we got to go. So you see right now, the frame rails are welded to the cross rail, and the firewall is welded. The outside cowl panels are clamped on just to make sure they fit good. But the firewall was jigged off our front pieces. It only goes in one spot, so we went ahead and we welded it. The rear trunk pan, you see we just have clamps in it. They're on the frame rails, and the frame rails are slightly tacked. Like I said, I did that. There's vice grips under there, but I did that so I can just cut the tacks off when it's done. We set the floor pan in the car. It fits perfect on our jig points under here that we did in line with our cross rail. So I know the humps here fit good. It fits on our firewall perfect. So I'm confident the front of this car is 100% correct. looking at the trunk pan to the floor pan, it fits pretty good. I mean, it might be able to come forward a little bit, but this is where our gray area starts. Looking underneath the car, the frame rails are pretty far. They're 3/4, 7/8 of an inch difference from the frame rail itself to the torque box area underneath on the floor pan. So this is a big red flag. That's why we jig everything up, because I know that if these points line up and those don't line up, I mean, we got an issue. And we build the car, you saw, in 2 sections, the rear section first and the front section. The reason being, the floor pan goes last and joins the 2 together. That's why I don't weld it. And we want to make sure the trunk pan's straight and everything. So I decided that there's a big red flag. We decided to put the outer wheelhouses on the car. I'm pretty confident the outer wheelhouses are pretty close. They fit in here, right there. They follow the arch really well. It's tight against the trunk floor, and it matches up in this corner down here. So why don't we put the inner wheelhouses on? So the problem is, we have a Detroit Speed mini tub kit going in this car. So what I asked the owner to do is, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna buy factory inner wheelhouses. That's gonna follow this arch right here and then follow the curvature on the inside here before we go ahead and cutting it up. The Detroit Speed ones, they just won't fit this car. So that's gonna be like our insurance policy, that we're gonna put them on, and I'm gonna put the quarter panel on, because I need to make sure the trunk pan, the tail panel, everything's in the right spot. Again, nothing's welded. So the question right now is, and what I also did, we used our tram. Don't forget, go back into video 1 when we put this car on the jig, and this goes with every car. If I could find the body measurements, we go through the body measurements. So going over the body measurements, and what I think I come up with what might be wrong with this car, and might be our issue. Again, I need the external body on the car to verify everything, and I'll show you how we're gonna fix it. So, and like I said, this stuff rarely happens, but it does happen. So luckily, I guess it's on video, and we'll catch it. Again, we're not stuck, we didn't lose anything. We're out a set of inner wheelhouses that I'm gonna commission for the owner, and we'll sell them to the next Nova we build. And I've never used Nova frame rail, so this is another learning process, but we can't be scared to use parts, you know, if they're damaged. We just gotta adapt and overcome. So what I did using this body measurement cart, I'm looking at the main points right now are G. So G is from this front body mount. This goes for both sides of the car, to the hole on the frame rail under here. That's our main hole on our frame rail measuring point. That is correct on both sides. So that G measurement, looking at the other ones, I have different notes, is gonna be 69 inches. So we're good from 69 inches from the front subframe mount to the hole in the frame rail on both sides. So where we start, and we did some cross measurements and everything, and they were close enough that we can just say this area is good, that area is good. But the main thing I'm worried about are the forward to back, because that's what we're having issues right now. So taking our second measurement, which would be I, that's gonna be the factory measurement, is the hole on the bottom of this frame rail to the center of the shackle. That measurement, now, this is the frame rail. You know, we didn't move anything. The frame rail's one piece. It's supposed to be 54 and 11/16. Well, that measurement I'm getting is 55 and 9/16. So it's been a long day, but doing the backwards math there, that's 7/8 of an inch. So there's our issue. That 7/8 of an inch is that measurement. So off the top of my head, 2 things are wrong. Either the hole's wrong in the front of this frame rail, and the frame rail's just short. You know, that's step 1 might be it. But being that the frame rail's too long, I wonder, you know, if they just put the hole in the wrong spot and put it too far back, and the center of the frame rail is short in the center. Second thing, maybe the shackle's in the wrong spot. And don't forget, our rear point, if we go back to the beginning of this video, is jigged off that shackle bracket. That's a key That's what I built the whole rear end off, was this shackle bracket. It fits right in there. So if, now AMD's a little bit closer than the Dynacorn. We're talking 1/8 of an inch, you know, maybe 1/4 of an inch, but I think it's on more on the 1/8 of an inch side. But, and the pictures look worse. What I do, I hammer the frame rails open because most of the time when I put these cars in there, you have to force it back. And what I do, I hammer the frame rails back, pull the floor pan up, and then we screw it in. But again, we're somewhat of 7/8 of an inch difference off. We have a problem where we have to stop what we're doing. So again, it might be our shackle mount. Something is obviously not matching up with these frame rails for the factory measurements. So what we're gonna do, this video is gonna be put on hold for a week because now we have to wait for inner wheel houses. I'm at a point right there that's a $200 insurance policy. We're gonna put the inner wheel houses in the car. We're gonna screw them into the outers. We're gonna cut these off, put the whole entire quarter panel on the car. We're gonna put the cross rail deck filler panel up there. I'm not too worried about the trunk. And we're gonna put the tail panel on. That's gonna show us right now if the external sheet metal matches up on this car and everything looks good. Well, then we just have to fix the frame rail area. The good thing is I know that, you know, the back of the frame rail is welded into the cross rail. The floor pan sits against the cross rail. Pulling it forward would not help us. So we know if everything fits back here, well, at that point, we have to cut the front of this frame rail and move that forward. The owner's also gonna bring the frame rail pockets up in there. I sent them home with the car thinking we didn't need them, but we're gonna put them in there because that has the mount for the frame rail and the 2 mounts for the floor pan. So we're gonna make sure all that's good. We might have to move that part forward and add part of the frame rail there. Let's just say our shackles are in the wrong spot and we jig this whole rear end off the shackles. And then maybe this just gotta come, I mean, it's got some play in it, so you could move it forward. So say the whole rear end of this car has to come up forward 3/4, 7/8 of an inch. That's not a problem. What we're gonna do, we'll cut the bottom of those mounts, and then there's a tack up in the front mount. We're gonna cut those and we're gonna move the whole rear end of this car forward. The good thing, and I'm assuming if you're doing this at home and you're putting leaf springs on the car, let's be realistic. Shackles, you know, your shackle angle in the back, you have your spring arch, the shackles are gonna move in the back. They should be vertical on a good set of springs, and that controls your unloading and loading characteristics of the shackles. But in a street car, if you put them on there and they're too far back, they're just gonna load the car a little bit. They'll actually be a little bit better on the traction because you think about it, they're gonna push down on the shackle before they unload. So saying that, this car's going 4-link. So we're not so worried about the rear shackles. Whatever it is, we'll fix it in a week. I just need to make sure we get the external sheet metal on the car. So stay tuned. We'll come back. We'll be fresh on it. I'll look at it again. We took our measurements. Everything on this car is completely fixable. We just got to do our due diligence and just verify everything. So stay tuned. We'll be back and I'll show you what happened with these frame rails and we'll assess what's going on with them.
So fast forward a little bit, you see I got the inner wheel houses in the car. They were delivered, the quarter panels are on the car, and I'm going to go ahead right now and install the package tray area to then install the top deck filler area on the Nova. So the first thing I need to do is take out what was left of the old package tray and clean that area up to then go ahead and install the new package tray. You see, we did prep this area. The package tray is another part that we're just test fitting it. There's no holes in there. There's no weld through primer. Just like the rest of the parts on this car, the owner wants everything stripped down and epoxy primered, so we will go ahead and sandblast it on the second go around. This part is just like we're doing the rest of the parts. Screwing in everything, verifying our measurements, making sure everything fits and this thing looks good, and then just installing everything to pull them back out. It's a long, lengthy process, but it really saves the time and energy for like the frame rail issues that we're having. We're also going to put in this rear seat divider. This was the factory divider. I can pretty much line up the holes and know we're about right. This is also going to give us some more support here in the center of the Nova. So when I just start taking more parts apart and taking the package tray apart, that everything kind of just holds together without adding any more brackets. So now that this is installed, let's go over all the parts.
All right, so it's been about a week. We got some more parts for the 70 Nova. As you could see, we've installed them, test fit them on the car. Normally, this is the process that happens no matter what, that we throw these parts on before each section. Now, saying that, what you wouldn't see is normally we'd weld the whole floor up, everything would be good, and then we'd come back around and then test fit these parts. But since, like you saw on, about 2 minutes ago, that we had the problem with the floor pan, it's time to go ahead, like I said, and test fit everything and see where we're at. And I did come up with some stuff. So realistically, why I put these parts on there, I also cut the door jamb areas off the old car. You saw we installed and cut off the old package tray area, and I have the new package tray for the most part test fit in there. I'll have to pull it off and sandblast it and everything else. But realistically, I know now all the external sheet metal on the car for the most part fits. And now where we're at is how to fix our issue with the frame rail. So what I come up with, one, door jamb is good. Obviously, it's centered off the car door jamb. So when we look at the length of this Nova and the quarter panel, we come down here to the corner of the trunk and a quarter of the quarter panel. What that leaves us about 1/2 inch that this trunk pan should be forward. Okay, so there's our one sign that we got about 1/2 inch difference here. When we look on these inner wheel houses that I installed, where they curve around on the inside, and this is why I was trying to tell the owner, we really need this. I know it's extra money, and honestly, if anyone has a Nova they want me to build in the future, get with me first. I might have a set of inner wheel houses for sale that's already been tested and being good. But both sides of the inner wheel houses, you could see, same deal. There's about 1/2 inch they can come forward. And that's gonna, again, match our measurement here. So when we go to this bottom area, the inside of the inner wheelhouse, you can look from the inside, same thing. There's 1/2 inch where the trunk and trunk drop-offs gotta go forward 1/2 inch. So you're seeing a trend here. When we look on these leaf spring front mount points, I usually do a lot of my jigs, my F-bodies and everything, I have done them off these pieces because they're so crucial in locating the floor pan and the frame rails. The reason I did it on this car is I was hoping to maybe get a 4-link mocked up that used these plates and everything. I didn't want to cut the mount, so I was kind of hoping to get around it, and that's why I modified this jig. My last Nova jig would have solved this problem and wouldn't have been an issue, and so I tried to do this one a little different. And again, we experiment and try to make things better. Sometimes we realize, oh, well, that idea we had beforehand was better. And what I did on that old Nova jig was I located this back pan right here. So located that back pan right on the center, so I knew where that is. If you look at the CUDA over here, same thing. You see we jig off the shackle on the E-body cars. And what I do is when the shackle comes in, this point right here is this bottom rear cross rail. So I know the rear cross rail, and that bolt, the same thing, it goes right into the back of the frame rails. So I know cross rail goes here, frame rails come right into it, and that's our distance that sets us forward. So if you're interested in the CUDA, we already test fit all these parts. They're in weld through primer, and we're gonna start putting them on real soon. So that video is gonna be coming out. But on the Novas, same thing, what I would do in the future. So if you watch this video, hopefully you'll watch me in order, because if you put aftermarket frame rails in the Nova, and we built a bunch of Novas on the old frame jig, no issues. But this is the first one with frame rails. So if you're doing aftermarket frame rails, the shackles are off in the location. I'll show you where I think. But I would sit there and make some kind of piece so you know where your rear cross rail is located. So that will locate, these will help locate the front. and you can make some bracket to locate the rear cross rail. So if you do aftermarket frame rails, like I said, you know they're gonna be, they seem like they're gonna be off. The AMD one seems closer. Looking at these bottom pockets, and like I said, they're adjustable, but you could see same thing. When we go on the floor pan, we're again about a 1/2 inch off versus where this whole trunk section can go forward. So what we're gonna end up doing and where the issue is, I did measure from the shackle to the rear cross rail. That's the same on a factory car. We also have verified that from this front hole to the front of the car following the factory measurements is correct. So when we verified, like I said, the hole from here to the cross rail, it's 7/8 of an inch difference. That's longer. So realistically, what I think, somewhere in this bend or whatever on this cross rail in the center between the shackle and that front point, we're too short. I mean, the frame rail's too long. So it's pushing the trunk pan back at least 1/2 inch. So what I hear a bunch of builders, a couple builders saying that they won't build these 68 to 72 Novas if the inside rockers or frame rails need to be replaced. And I guess we're seeing why. I'm not saying don't use the frame rails. What I'm saying right now is now we know an issue, and this is why I'll take on these projects. I mean, we learn from them. It stinks that it happened to this owner, but I couldn't thought of a better person to work with through this issue with. He's been really supportive. He was up here dropping the parts off. He looked at the whole car and he's super happy with it, and we talked about the plan forward. I wanted to include this part of the video on it. Like, I could have just sat there and fixed this whole trunk pan and you would never know. And then if you're building at home, you put a frame rail in and, well, why doesn't mine fit? So realistically, this happens every now and then. Usually they go pretty smooth, but sometimes we'll get a thing like this where just something goes wrong. And what we have to do is we have to prepare for it, i.e. not welding anything in, and then we have to know how to fix it. So I hate to do this, but this video is going to be a part 2. It's already getting too long. And I guess we'll build up some suspense. I do have a plan, and I'm going to show you very detailed on the next video. I don't feel like we can cover it enough in this video and everything else on how to section and move the whole front bottom of this car together, making sure wheelbase doesn't shift or change, and fix it where these front leaf spring mounts would go in. We make sure our heights stay the same back here, because the heights look great. I mean, honestly, that is the one thing about the frame jig. You see we're lined up perfect. We're not bowing anything. It fits real tight in these drip rails, and the door jamb already looks good. Obviously, we're not welding quarter panels in. I put the whole front end on these cars because of that. But the test fit on phase 1, there are a lot of positive things that we're looking forward on the car. We just got to walk that whole trunk section forward. So I'll show you how we're going to do that. That's going to be on another video. You kind of get a glimpse of what this car is going to look like, and you realize that things happen in this shop too. We just adapt and overcome. And then, I'm not scared to try new cars, different builds. I mean, we can do the same 3 cars all the time, but I will work with any new car that comes in the shop. If they make parts, we'll come up with a plan. We'll figure out what happened. I'll try my best to make sure that we avoid this. And now I know, for instance, in the 68 to 72 Novas, how my jig's going to be improved and adapted. And I'm passing on to you how, when you're jigging these cars up, definitely go off the cross rail, because that seems like a very important piece of the car that I haven't done. Well, I did do it, but I've changed it thinking we can fix it in a different way. So the main thing, like I said, level jig, key measurements on the car to start with, and then if there's an issue, you just stop what you're doing, think about it for a little bit, take your measurements, reference your original measurements and everything else, and I think it'll come out okay. So I will say again, car's looking good. Next episode will be part 2, where we fix our trunk pan. We move it forward, we weld up the floor pan, everything else, the package tray, we kind of get that all welded in there, and this will be all blown apart, Everything will be epoxy primed, and then we'll do a quick walk around of all the work we did. Again, I'm sorry it's a two-part video, but I'm trying to keep these short, and this video is already too long, even without the issue that we're doing. So I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. If you like this kind of stuff, subscribe, like the channel, like the videos, please comment, that all helps, and we'll see you on the next round. Take care.